In my field, it's about people, and the people issues are pretty much universal. You need to identify their needs, their pain points, and then what you need to do is develop this social currency, and this is building that relationship and going out to talk to people when you don't want something.
Best podcast, tap in. That's it. Subscribe.
This is STU Street, episode 12. I am your host, Sam Morra, and today I am sitting down with Dr. Matthew Reis. Dr. Matt is an organizational behavior psychologist and a professor at the Questrom School of Business at Boston University. His expertise is in management development that spans from small businesses to large corporations, as well as in education both inside and outside of the classroom. Dr. Matt's credentials speak for themselves, but the journey he has taken to get where he is today speaks to his unique and invaluable perspective on business, psychology, and life as a whole. Dr. Matt, it's an honor to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sam. It certainly has been a circuitous route, and I never could have predicted where I wound up today.
And that kind of leads me into something a mentor of mine actually told me the other day. He gave me an insightful tidbit where he said, you can see the next 3 steps in front of you, but the trail beyond that is invisible. Once you take those 3 steps, the next 3 steps are then illuminated. This process continues, and while you actively take steps towards a goal, you may end up somewhere else. However, the value you sought to find in the initial goal will still exist, just in a different form, and you will end up where you need to be. While I don't want to project, I think this little anecdote illustrates a bit about your life in an overarching way. While you are a PhD and professor today, this may not have been what you expected to become when you were young. You began your academia as a freshman at the University of Massachusetts as a psychology major. Many students choose to attend college for different reasons, whether they be career opportunities, personal knowledge, external pressures, or a combination of a few. What were your drivers that made you attend college, and more specifically choose psychology?
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk about that. I would add to that kind of anecdote that sometimes you take 2 or 3 steps forward and then realize you need to take 4 or 5 steps backwards to figure out what should be the next 3 steps. And I think it kind of, foreshadows one of the themes is that don't be afraid to admit you made a mistake and to try something different. I think that has really been important for me. And in terms of, starting off in school, I think it was because my dad was a professor at UMass, taught English, that it was a foregone conclusion that I would be going to college and pursuing something worthy in terms of, an academic discipline. And my parents didn't pressure me to become a lawyer or an accountant. They just, do something, follow your passion. And the problem was that in high school, I actually started college my senior year of high school and was going to UMass for free, where my dad taught, working pretty much full-time in the restaurant industry, and just taking everything for granted. And I wasn't in school because I wanted to be. And to answer your initial question, why psychology? I was just trying to figure out who I was as a teenager, and, oftentimes a confusing time. I didn't know which way I was going, which 3 steps I should be planning to take. And I said, well, these are the 3 easiest steps to take. Go to school, go for free, live at home, make good money working in the restaurant industry. And I just had more fun and, more priority put on hanging out with my friends than on my academic pursuits.
So your initial kind of step towards college was you had an idea of where your life might be headed in a general sort of way, but you still wanted to narrow down that pathway. Is that correct?
I think that's a very generous kind of characterization of my planning at that time. I think it was the expectation is you go to school. I knew getting a college degree would allow me to have more career options, careers that paid better money. That was really as far as I had seen at this point. I was much more living in the present at that time in my life. And one of the reasons that I decided I needed to take a break from college and figure out me and what I wanted to do, because I really wanted to have at least the first 2 steps more clearly defined, because right then I was like, this is the path somebody else laid for me. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the most important things when it comes to your career and figure out what you want to do is it has to be something you want to do, and not because your parents, friends, or because this career makes a lot of money. Those are all things you should take into consideration, but they're not things that are going to make you motivated and satisfied in the long run.
Yeah, time is limited, and if you spend it living someone else's life, then you're not going to get to where you want mentally. So you decided after your sophomore year to take that break. from school and moved out to California. What drove you to make that decision, and how did you know that was right for you at that time?
Well, I mean, the short answer is I was just screwing around. I wasn't taking my studies seriously. I was coasting and getting basically B's and C's. And I decided that I needed a change. And it wasn't so much that I had this great opportunity in California. Back then, we didn't have the internet. Basically, we had television and magazines. California, all they ever show you is, kind of the nicest things on the beach and all of the really nice areas, Bel Air and Hollywood. And, so I said, I'm going to go out there because my sister was there. So it was just convenient for me to go out there and to figure out what I wanted to do with my future.
And so you, in a way, started from scratch. What mentality did this entail, and how did you kind of lay out those next steps for yourself?
Well, I think it was one of those things where it was experience, it was hardship, it was having to fend for myself. So I went from living at home and having a car, which wasn't paid for, so I had to return it when I moved to California. I rode a bicycle. I took public transportation. I had to find a job. I had to be able to pay rent. And so that motivated me to get a job and to start working again in the restaurant industry. And it was something that, kind of led to my career, which was spanning 10 years. I started out as a dishwasher and then became a cook and then became a waiter in Massachusetts, went to California, became a bartender and then a manager. And it was at that point of becoming a manager after 4 years that I realized I wasn't a good manager and I didn't want to spend my career in the restaurant industry or something like that, something that didn't value my intellect. It valued my task and ability to achieve something for someone else. And I realized at that point, even though it wasn't clear what I wanted to do, I needed to go back to school and figure out how to be a better manager, a better leader, and for myself, a better person.
Yeah. And were there any points where you received feedback to understand what you were doing wrong? Because you mentioned that you found out you weren't necessarily a great manager, but we were able to excel to get to that place. So a lot of times when you're focused on a goal or a task at hand, you might be blinded to those around you and how your actions are actually affecting that work. So can you pinpoint any moments of feedback there?
Well, I can tell you a lot of the opportunities for feedback that were missed along the way. So early on, when I was not such a good manager, I was promoted from within the ranks of the bartenders to become the bar manager. And people who were my friends, I was now taking this approach like, you need to do this because I'm the boss, because I said so. And I was very task focused. And those people, we didn't really hang out much outside of work anymore because I kind of lost some of the trust and some of the friendship that I had as a coworker. And I just attribute, well, that's, what happens when you go to management. People, don't like being told what to do. And so I got the feedback, but it didn't really resonate. It didn't register for me until years later that I was able to get feedback from others along in my professional development. And feedback has been so important, but sometimes we're not ready to hear that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And the idea of those relationships needing to change when you move up in an organization, what's your perspective on that? Is that truly the case as you move up in rank, or is that just a fabrication of how we believe organizations are run?
Well, organizations are made up of people. And so this is why it's so critical that we understand that whether we like it or not, politics and influence and power, which sometimes connotes, things that people don't want to think about in organizations, the way you get things done is by making alliances, by developing relationships, by having networks, and not being afraid to use influence to get things. And it doesn't have to be in a negative way. You can influence others in a way that is reciprocal, that you can do something and help them up, they can help you or help someone else. And so that's something that I developed over years. But I was very fortunate that most of my career has been aided by people in my network and people that I had helped either inadvertently or directly that were then helping me get ahead, and feedback and mentoring were some of those key cornerstones.
Seems like moving through those challenges gave you great opportunities for growth. And as a psychologist, you probably have your own take on the following, but Nietzsche believed that suffering is imperative to growth and to change. Without points of suffering, we lose the opportunity to reach our full potential. Do you believe that the suffering you experienced as a new manager led you to see the path to improvement ahead, and then as you went back to school?
Oh, absolutely. I think hardship, I think that for those people who have suffered in some way, that whether it's because of their own failings, because of the environment, but for some reason they weren't able to achieve or they weren't happy with where they were in life, is a great motivator for many of us. And for me, it was my inability to be effective in the relationship side of management when I was 21 that got me to go back to school and continue studying psychology and figure out that I wanted to go into organizational behavior. So it was pretty, self-centered at first. I was like, I want to be a better manager. And then I was like, well, maybe I could help other people be better managers. Oh, that's a possible career path. And that's where it kind of opened up to me. It was actually, I remember sitting in my, kind of psychology of work class and realizing that, this whole field existed when I didn't really know that organizational behavior was a whole subset of social psychology. And that's what I wanted to go into, because prior to that, I was thinking human factors and how people interact with technology and how, I was really interested in cars, how they design cars so the switches feel natural or in the right place. And so that people are more efficient and effective with that human machine interface. And I realized, people's what the people are really what interests me. I'm going to focus on that and those social interactions, because at the time, I didn't think I was that good at it. And I wasn't. If I was listening to the feedback, I wasn't. I was very focused on the task and had very high standards, but that could be sometimes off-putting if all you focus on is getting the job done.
And being able to recognize when you're not good at something but want to become good at it is vitally important because it gives you that opportunity. So you ultimately returned to school and dedicated yourself to academia for over a decade. First, you completed your bachelor's in psychology at California State University, and then you got both your master's and a doctorate in organizational behavior from Claremont Graduate University. Did you know upon going back to school that you were going to complete this full track?
No, I didn't. At first, I was thinking that I just wanted to learn more about management and leadership, and then as I kind of got into some of the career paths, I realized that having a BA in psychology wasn't going to open many doors. I wasn't going to be able to get the jobs that I wanted. I'd have to get at least a master's degree. And I think that I pursued the doctorate because my father was a PhD, and I really valued learning for its own sake. That's one of the things that motivates me intrinsically. And so at the time, because I was thinking, I had this, strange bias against, what my dad did. He was an English professor. He never seemed like grounded in like practical problems and getting the work done. He was talking about Chaucer and Shakespeare and all this stuff, which his students loved. And reflecting back, realized he'd made a tremendous contribution to society. But at the time, I was focused like, what can make me money and what's going to help getting the task done? Yeah. And that's what I focused on initially. But my love of learning was the thing that made me say, I'm going to get my PhD as well. Probably a little bit of like I'd like to get recognition from my parents, but in the end I was so glad that I got the doctorate, because that then allowed me, as I am today, to pursue a career that is much more fulfilling than the one I originally envisioned.
So you had a blend of drivers, it seems like. Just that intrinsic knowledge was definitely a major component of that, and be able to just garner the understanding of the people around you. But also you did have to take into account the other factors, such as being able to get the jobs you want to down the road and setting yourself up well as maybe those external pressures from parents or just how you want them to view you. So I'm assuming that your education also helped you understand your pitfalls and strengths a little bit better. Were you able to reflect back on your early career as a manager from a more educated standpoint?
Oh, absolutely. And it's one of the things when students come and ask me if they should pursue a graduate degree or a PhD right after getting their bachelor's. And I say, no, you really want to have work experience. And so that was so critical when I went into grad school, that I had been a manager and I had so many lessons to learn from that and areas for improvement that I could reflect back on that, where other people who hadn't had management experience were just kind of talking about the theory of it. And until you experience and have that firsthand, success and failure, as I did, you don't really have a kind of a benchmark. You don't have a way to say, am I doing better? Am I improving? Have I learned something? Because maybe some people are better learning vicariously than I am. But for me, if I've experienced it, it's really like, now I get it. And now I know. It's like when we talk about, have you had a good experience with a boss or with a teacher, you don't really know until you have a really bad boss or really bad teacher to kind of calibrate the two ends of that. And once you've had a really bad boss or teacher, you appreciate those good bosses, those good mentors so much more.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And you talked a little bit about theory versus practice there. Mm-hmm. And so actually, while you were seeking your doctorate, you actually worked simultaneously in the practical field. And you worked as a behavioral consultant for Atlantic Richfield Company. Mm-hmm. So not only being able to balance your time in that way, how were you able to balance your perspective on theory versus practice? And how did this perspective change since you entered school?
So I think it was a really significant aha moment for me because I'd got my master's degree. I was working on my doctorate, but I knew if I had a PhD without relevant experience as a practitioner of organizational behavior, organizational development, that I wouldn't be able to get a job that I would want at that point of getting the doctorate. And so I really wanted to get experience. And when I went into ARCO, which is now part of British Petroleum, I had my master's degree. I had all these great ideas about theory and best practice and case studies and how to make organizations more effective. And I knew it was about getting managers to work better with their people and to motivate them and to provide a vision, and so that they knew the path to the goal. All these things. And I went in there with my, here's my analysis, here's what you need to do, here's the 100% solution. And I did this by coming up with the solution in a vacuum. I thought I was very well informed by research and all these other companies that I had looked at, but I hadn't talked to the people, all the managers who were working in the company to say, what are your pain points? Mm-hmm. What are the challenges you face on a day-to-day basis? So here it was, this person coming from the ivory tower saying, you are not doing a good job, here's what you need to do, and it's all in theory. Wrong approach. I learned, and I had some very good mentors there. The person who hired me, Sylvia Fong, and another person who worked in our ARCO products company, Dennis Stern. They were both seasoned HR. Dennis actually is a PhD of organizational psychology as well, and were my mentors early on, saying, listen, you got great energy, but you can't walk into a room with people with 20 years experience on you and saying, look, you're doing it wrong. I'm super smart. Do it this way. Even if you're 100% right. And this was coming back to, how do you influence people? How do you build relationships? And this was the first kind of test that I failed. Going back to the manager years, you said reflecting on that, and I was like, what am I doing wrong? But fortunately, now I had people who really invested in my success and making the company successful and said, maybe you're going to go back and talk to all these people and find out that the 80% or 70% good solution is what you're going to get buy-in for. That'll get implemented, and then people will benefit from it. Having the 100% solution that goes into the recycle bin doesn't benefit anybody, and it hurts your reputation.
So it's kind of like creating data points for them to actually see what you're trying to implement, as well as creating an individualized approach. So theory as a whole kind of blankets what you're trying to do for the company, but you need to fit it to what they personally need.
Absolutely. You need to identify their needs, their pain points, and then what you need to do is develop this social currency. And this is by talking to them and building that relationship and showing them that you can help them. It's not about you coming in from corporate or HR to help and saying, here's some additional tasks. You have some more forms to fill out. Trust me, it'll be good for you. And so that's not the way that you influence people effectively. You have to start with what are their needs. And this is the thing that always was a bit of a disconnect for me, because my number one value, whenever I look at values and kind of career planning, was to help people. And so when I get feedback that I'm not helping, that's something that I'm like, I need to work on this. How can I actually have the impact to help? Intent was, I want to help. Impact was, they say I'm not helping. Okay, why is that disconnect there? And I would go back and obsess over it and figure out what's going wrong, talk to my mentors, talk to others, do more research, and learn. And that's one of the things I think that has helped me in my career so much, is learning to be a little more humble and also being willing to admit I was wrong. And this is something that, because I was very shy growing up, I didn't admit. So I often came across as like, oh, there's that, person who thinks he knows it all, and he's got, this attitude that he's better than us. And that was the furthest from the truth. I was like, oh my God, I'm afraid that they're not going to think that I'm credible, that I'm not an expert, and, I'm an imposter. And so I only can say things when I know I'm 100% right, and I better say it with authority. Mm-hmm. But that's not real. That's not genuine. And that either scares people off or they dismiss you as a phony.
And you said creating trust is very important for these relationships. And that authenticity definitely plays into that. You were also now working on a larger scale with these companies. Mm-hmm. And so you went from kind of a micro level where you're working directly with a small team managing in the restaurant and bar space to now overseeing development plans for thousands of employees. Was this process initially daunting for you, and how did you approach it differently than that smaller scale?
Well, it definitely was a different scale. And so some of it was a little bit comforting because now I wasn't having to make that direct impact on a small group, but I was there helping to create programs that would help other managers in a very large organization be more effective with their employees. I learned something from my time, as a manager at 21, that I had to work on building the relationships, building the trust with people, and letting them know that my intention was to help them, and that, it's quite possible that A, I don't have all the facts, and B, I don't have the best plan before I get those facts, and to learn to listen. And that was, I think, one of the most important things that I was able to do so that I could build those relationships. And it was not something that happened overnight. I wouldn't say I got it. I realized this in my, mid-20s, and took me a decade to get really, really, I think proficient at it in terms of having people sense that I was being genuine, that I was being authentic, and I really did want to help, and getting over my own, insecurities and, and kind of mastering the craft. For some people, building relationships is very natural. And for others, diving into the research and the theory, that part is really kind of abstract and, not something that's comfortable for them. I was coming from, I'm comfortable with the theory, and how do I then translate it back to earth in terms of how normal, everyday people talk about their relationships at work, their relationship with their boss, how they feel about work, without talking down to them, and it was never my intent, but that was sometimes the impact. If you start citing studies and famous authors like Peter Drucker and, this person and that person, that doesn't mean anything. They want to know, how do I make my life better? How do I get my employees motivated so that they can produce more? Because my boss is on me to, increase production and reduce defects in the quality of our products.
I think in your field, being authentic is definitely very important, but I think that also applies to all professions. Mm-hmm. And people often have the term fake it till you make it, where they kind of bury those insecurities until they're able to develop that confidence. How do you think you can expedite the process of developing confidence and feeling like you belong in an organization?
One of the best ways to do that is to get out there and talk to people. And as students, it's something I wish I had done. We now teach this in their career development classes at BU, but to go out and do informational conversations, to get out there and talk to people in the industry, in the profession that you're thinking about going in, to learn what it's like in the day of the life, what are their challenges. But as an employee, one of the things I've done a lot of new employee onboarding programs for companies is that we make sure that those new employees aren't just going in and sitting at their desk and immediately starting work. If they have any, kind of client base internally, externally, to go on a listening tour, to go and talk to those people that they'll be working with in accounting, in marketing, in operations, to get to know them. Because when you run into a problem, it's going to be picking up the phone like, hey, Sam, I need you to do this for me. And if you don't know me, you're like, oh, yeah, I got 5 people ahead of you. Yeah. But if I've taken that time to say, hey, Sam, tell me what you do here. What are the things that kind of like, eat your lunch every day? And, I want to know what I could do possibly to help you in the future, and extend that offer, even knowing you're brand new and you can't fulfill that today, but building that relationship and going out to talk to people when you don't want something.
Also, do you feel that building those relationships can make it easier that when you get stuck, it's not, those insecurities I feel like will come out more if you haven't built those relationships, because now you need to jump from just talking to someone to now immediately asking a favor, which you would have felt uncomfortable with from the start. So building those relationships, I feel like, is not only for your help in the long run, just people-wise, but also personal development.
Oh, absolutely. And, that was double for me because I had this social awkwardness anyways coming out of my teen years, and I had to kind of resolve those issues. But I think it was going back to this notion of social currency, and that if you get out there and you force yourself, and I had an early boss who forced me to get out there and talk to people when I wanted to sit in the office and just kind of, come up with, solutions to problems. Again, very well intended, but that's not the way things get done in the real world. So I had to fake it till I made it by getting out there, being nervous and being worried about, are people going to like me? Are they going to respect me?
Yeah.
But the thing that kept me going was my underlying drive was to help people, to make the organization more effective. And that was why my purpose. And that's why I was in the organization. So if that meant I had to go be uncomfortable and fake it till I make it, it was a worthy cause to do so for.
And today you pass that knowledge on to students as an educator. But prior to becoming a professor yourself, your experience on the professional side of education began when you were a manager of organizational development at Babson. What did you discover to be different about developing organizational plans and training mechanisms within a university versus a traditional company?
Honestly, very little. And I see a lot of bias, I think, in hiring. I certainly interviewed for other jobs. I've had a lot of people who worked for me or who got advice that if you start in, say, energy as I did, if you start in biotech or if you start in financial industry, that you can't then go and work in another industry because you don't understand their issues. In my field, it's about people, and the people issues are pretty much universal, right? If someone's asking me to sequence a gene at a biotech firm, I have no business doing that. I'm there to help people with their leadership, with their teams, with their conflict, right? All those skills are very transferable between these different industries. And so when I went into higher ed and administration, I was surprised at, I think, some of the divisions, kind of the faculty staff divide that you sometimes see. And but this was no different than looking at the people in research and development in biotech. They were the rainmakers in that field, right? You go into finance, right? Who are the people that are making the bottom line for that company? Those are always the people that are going to be the superstars. And so once you figure out the dynamics of the organization, the people problems are largely the same. So that was something that actually gave me comfort because I felt like, hey, I know this. I can help people with interpersonal conflict. I can help people to be better leaders. And of course, underlying all of these things, we all have a personality. We all have our issues. We all have our strengths. And so helping people to understand, where do I live? And then how do I interact? How do I impact with others? It's always been a cornerstone for whether or not I've been able to help people to be more effective in their roles.
And so you also got more involved with curriculum development when you joined Insight as a program manager and higher ed course developer. So it seems like you started to create a trajectory where you were moving into education more and more. What overlap did you see in developing academic curriculum and developing organizations as a whole?
Well, I think there is a fair amount of overlap. One thing that's not in there is I also spent time in a doctoral leadership program teaching for the University of Phoenix. And that was prior to joining Insight, where they then asked me to help create courses. And so I'd been creating training programs for leadership and for executives and for talent management and all sorts of types of things that we want in organizations. And these were really just kind of very short courses, maybe a week long, maybe it was, over the course of a year when you had a half-day program every other month, with mentoring and advisors and those kind of things. Very similar. What do we want to get? We want to get knowledge and behavior, right? Those are the things that we want to see change for people. And for some of these that are more developmental, we want to take in people, say, straight out of college and have them grow over 5 years. We want to see maturity. We want to see organizational knowledge, institutional knowledge grow. And so it was one of the things where I think it was comforting when I look back that there was a lot that I had to draw from in terms of my previous experience and skill sets, that these were not that far apart. One of the things about working for Insight is I was a program manager, and my entire team, and I would have 10, 12 people on this team, they were all contract workers and they were all virtual. So those were things that, now is with COVID, we know those are some real challenges, but getting someone who's not performing, who isn't coming into the office, you don't have a face-to-face, who doesn't work technically for you because they've on a separate contract, getting them motivated and addressing those performance issues, that can be very challenging. And that's something that many managers face when we have so many workers who are remote and who are contract workers as companies try to minimize their kind of overhead expenses.
That's interesting to hear also that you had that experience with remote workers prior to the pandemic. Did that make it easier as a professor when you were faced with those challenge of remote students to be able to kind of curb that learning curve?
I think there definitely are some parallels there. It was one of those things where looking at my management of, kind of project workers going to students, the students all really wanted to be there in the class, and it was really tough not to be there. I think with, remote workers, some of whom they kind of considered that a consolation. They wanted a full-time job somewhere else. They didn't have it, so they had to kind of backfill with, other work. And so I was doing consulting at the same time I was doing this. I was doing other work as well. I was teaching for University of Phoenix. So I had multiple gigs going on. And my goal was I want to have one full-time job. I just had that, I had been in that full-time role before. To me, that was like the recognition that you are, a valuable member of an organization, and we want to pay you, a fair salary. We want to give you benefits and retirement and healthcare and all the stuff that it's part of your identity. So I knew that from an early age. I strongly liked to identify with an organization, and so, doing contract work, doing consulting was much more lucrative than working, for a company. But, there's the ups and downs. You have to deal with the clients. And even if the clients are going to pay you a lot of money, does that mean that you want to go provide training or an assessment that they want, but you kind of goes against what you think is what they really need? And that's the part that I was, as much as I knew that relationships were important, I wasn't going to bend and recommend things or provide things that weren't going to actually help the employees of that company. And so I talked myself out of a lot of potentially very profitable consulting gigs because of that.
And you seem to have found your values through all of that. You worked as an independent consultant for over 15 years through all of this. And you talked about how you wanted that one full-time gig and to kind of eliminate all those extra avenues. So you were working 3 pathways at once when you were working for University of Phoenix, independent consultancy, as well as being a professor, correct?
Well, I wasn't full-time. I was teaching part-time.
Okay. What made that jump to then actually making the move to say, okay, I just want this one full-time pathway?
And so, it comes back to networking. It comes back to the relationships you build. I fell into my career at Boston University because a friend of mine went to take a job in private industry and had an organizational behavior class that needed to be taught in 3 weeks. And so I said, sure, I'll be happy to teach it. Didn't know what I was getting into, but I loved it. And then I sought out more opportunities to teach and continued to teach. And then by networking and just by going out and talking to people about what I love, which is organizational behavior, that I wound up at Questrom. And then I started teaching there full time. And I feel that the students, by and large, really appreciate the knowledge and what it's going to do for them in terms of their ability to achieve their goals. And that appreciation, I think, was really something that kept me in teaching until I became full-time.
So is that something that you would say you could only really learn inside the classroom, and that you don't think you necessarily would have came across if you remained just in the professional field as a consultant?
I don't think I ever would have come to that realization because my dad was a professor, and I didn't, because of what he taught and because I didn't value, literature as much as my parents did. My mother was a librarian and my dad was an English professor, so grew up with lots and lots of books, and I love to read, great appreciation, but to me, they're not task-oriented. I'm much more likely to have a DIY, how do you make this kind of book that I'm going to read as much as, a nonfiction book. And but I really like to focus on how can I help people? And that was coming back to my values, which really by this time had really solidified in terms of what's important to me in my life and my career. And I'm happy making less money than I could in other applications of organizational behavior, such as being a consultant or being, a vice president of people development or whatever, title it is at large companies. I have many friends who are in those roles at major companies, and they make great money, but they also have lots of stress, and they also have to deal with executives who maybe don't value the people side as much as the website. People are our greatest asset. They don't always live that. They know that they need the people to get the work done, but as we all know, there are layoffs, and there are maybe some putting up with bad behavior when you have some superstar managers or individual contributors. We can look the other way as long as they're adding value to the bottom line. So coming back to your question, the teaching definitely was something that reinforced that I can help people in a way that is appreciated, and that's something that really drew me in. And that's at that point, this is going back 10 years, decided I'm going to make a permanent career switch. I want to dedicate my life to teaching, at least for this phase. Who knows? In another 10 years, I might be on to another phase. But it wasn't planned. As we talked about the 3 steps, I never knew until I had one step into BU. I think I'd want to do this because I taught online, and that wasn't that special. I missed the face-to-face. I missed the in-person, the building of relationships, which can be done online, but is not. It's not as robust, I think, in terms of teaching, especially when what you're teaching is people skills, when you're teaching leadership, when you're teaching how do you deal with conflict. And as we all know from living through COVID, right, trying to deal with conflict on the phone or on Zoom is nowhere near as effective as it is in person. So
you're not working as a consultant currently, but I have a question based off what you were saying that might apply. Since COVID, there's been a lot more remote work and hybrid work that is seemingly going to be the trend going forward. Certain CEOs like Elon Musk are requiring in-person work, while others, Brian Chesky of Airbnb, say, hey, work from wherever as long as you're getting your work done. As an organizational behavior psychologist, what's your perspective on this matter, and what's the most efficient way to run an organization and to keep employees happy?
Well, you've asked what is the most efficient way, and you've also asked what is the most effective way to keep employees happy. Those are totally different things. So in the short run, organizations absolutely can be more efficient and retain current workers by having remote options. I love the fact that I work 2 days from home. Yesterday, I was in a meeting with my colleagues from across BU on one of these, kind of university task force that I'm on, and it's fine being online. However, whenever I get a chance to actually have the face-to-face in-person meetings, especially with people I haven't met, I always opt for that option because then you can actually build those relationships. Just seeing someone on a Zoom screen that you haven't met, you don't get that chance at the, getting coffee or at the break to kind of say, hey, tell me about your family, or what else do you like to do for fun? And, some of the relationships that I built here at BU, and the reason I got an offer to teach full time was because I did things outside of work. I went on ski trips, I went on picnics, and did things where I could build those relationships informally. And my concern about organizations that want to go just remote is, and I've heard this from my students who were hired in the COVID era, I spent a year working remote. I don't know anyone. I don't have a relationship with my boss. My boss promoted somebody else who I don't even think is qualified, but they knew them or they were in the office with them. So we have to be very, I think, judicious in our use of this. And I think it's a great way. Maybe you work, 2 days in the office and 3 days from home, but we're going to have Tuesdays and Thursdays be our, staff meeting days or our client pitch day or something. So we're getting together and getting FaceTime. We're human. And this technology is, it's a fraction of my life. It's brand new and it's a great time saver. But if you only address efficiency, you're going to give up on this human need for us to connect and for us to make mistakes, but also then for us to connect and say, hey, I screwed up. And it's a lot easier in person. We studied this back in the 90s at ARCO when we had dedicated a huge amount of money to these dedicated teleconference rooms. And it was to try to save on, travel budgets. Yeah. And for employees who had a relationship, they had no problem getting on, saying, hey, how you doing? And catching up and then getting right to work. But we dropped it after a couple of years because new employees never built those relationships and weren't effective. And at first they said, oh, it must be the employee. No, it turned out they weren't ever getting any face time, literally, with those people in those operating companies and those other locations in the field. And we realized they need to be able to go out and build relationships. So that's a cornerstone of who we are as people. And again, what I do is just look at people at work.
So it's definitely can be used as a tool beneficially, but becoming over-reliant on that, you lose that human nature part of it, especially for those new workers that don't have those relationships yet.
Right.
I think that's important for young people to hear, especially because a lot of times, even in my classes, professors have raised the question, hey, when you guys are out in the workforce, would you rather be hybrid, all remote, or all in person? And a lot of people that are currently in the college environment where they're overstressed and want to sleep, they think, oh, remote work would be great. But for those first few years as a college graduate moving into the workforce, it might be your enemy.
No, I agree completely, because the only way that you are going to be able to advance, assuming that some people have access to those decision makers and have the ability to grab coffee with them or chat with them at the water cooler, those people, even if they're not as qualified as you, are going to have an advantage. I've gotten more than half my jobs in my career because somebody knew me and could speak to my ability. It wasn't my ability to go out and say, hey, I'm the best. Even if I thought that, it was because somebody could say, hey, Matt, he's a hard worker. He's a smart guy. He can really help you. It's how I've gotten, most of my jobs. I got my jobs at BU through networking, not for applying for a job. Those jobs were never posted. And I never would have had that if I didn't have the face-to-face relationships, hadn't had the chance to go out and to meet people who then, advocated on my behalf and put me forward as a candidate. And that's, we teach this in our career development classes. 80% of the jobs are filled by somebody who has a network connection, somebody who's been referred in by another person who they have a real connection to. And you might be on paper the best candidate, but you may not get the job if someone isn't saying, hey, Sam should be at the top of our list. We should bring him in.
There's a lot of factors to consider when trying to land a position, especially as a young student. That social currency aspect that you've been reiterating is so vitally important. But I believe that there's this perspective amongst young people and especially college students that there is no room for experimentation if you want to be successful because they consider time a sunk cost. Often, students place a strict timetable on their journey to specific milestones and place unrealistic pressure on themselves to have a journey entirely mapped out. I find that this leads students to pursue avenues that might not be truly right for them, might not align with their passions or even their skills. Ultimately, that would lead them to not reach their full potential. I believe that figuring things out and doing things the wrong way to find the right way, as you've done in the past, is truly beneficial and can actually propel your career forward. What are your thoughts on that, and how do we kind of change that perspective amongst the youth?
Well, I think the thing that you said that gives me pause is saying to reach your full potential. When we're born and we have parents who are very well intentioned, right, that what is your best path? What is your full potential? And that's what somebody else has told you. And that's what career advisors and guidance counselors have told you. And, I wanted to be a stockbroker in high school because they made a lot of money. We had a family friend who was a stockbroker and they had a boat and I loved to sail. So of course, that's what I want to do. But it was just on the outcome. It was just, what does success look like? A lot of money, big house, nice car, right? Vacations. But what was meaningful to me? It's why that I teach now and don't make as much money as I used to, but I probably work more and I certainly enjoy my job more. And I feel I'm reaching, what I would consider my full potential as a teacher. It's a craft. It takes practice. It's hard, but it's also very, very rewarding. So you have to define for yourself what is rewarding. And we try to get students to do this. But like I said before, with like having a good boss or bad boss, you don't really know what you really like to do until you do it.
Yeah.
Students say, I like to get a grade. Well, why? Well, my parents think a lot of me, or I'll be able to get into this grad school, or I'll get this internship. Why? Well, then I'll be able to get a good job. What is a good job? High paying, prestigious firm, looks good on the resume. Why? And you keep asking why, and you can do this yourself or you can get me to do it, which is really annoying. But what is it that drives you? And I've said before, helping people is my number one motivator in life. And as my wife will tell you, sometimes I'm not helping. Sometimes, she'll have to smack me in the head and say, stop, you're not helping. You're well-intended, but you want to fix it. What I need is someone to listen. And honestly, in terms of my mentors, my wife, Vonnie, has been one of my biggest, in terms of helping me put things in perspective and, bring the emotional, bring the people side when I just want to analyze it and dissect and say, okay, well, here's your problem. If you do this and you influence point A, that you'll get leverage on person C, and then you'll get outcome D. And yeah, in theory, and we're going back to that, in theory on paper, that's exactly what needs to happen. Mm-hmm. But she wanted me to listen to her and empathize, right? And so we have to learn to pick up on those cues from other people. We have to learn what is going to be helpful in their eyes. What did they view as being useful, even if you would do something completely different? And that's something that as a psychologist, in theory, I completely understand. In practice, I've had to work my life at it, and I've gotten better at it. But there's always room for improvement. And so coming back to what is your purpose and how do you assess where you're at and maybe what your next steps are, you have to take it one day at a time, but always have a plan, have a 5-year plan, 10-year plan, 20-year plan. But those are way out in the future, as you said, and you might change based on your experience today or who you meet tomorrow.
So that plan is dynamic in a sense where it'll change as you go. And as we referred to a few times, having those 3 steps laid out can be very helpful, but having everything locked in stone for the next 20 years gives you a little leeway to experiment. And so a lot of people define success objectively and put it as this blanket statement of, okay, wealth attainment or fame or like eminence or whatever it may be. But in reality, it should be subjective to whatever your goals or passions are. What would your one piece of advice be besides just experimentation? How do you put yourself in the mindset as a 20-year-old or 21-year-old to open yourself up to that experimentation and relinquish all those external pressures?
Well, I don't think we ever truly can, because as social beings, most of us really value the opinion that others have, especially those who are in power and certainly our parents, but that don't be afraid to take risks. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. And that was one of the things that I didn't. I missed out a lot during high school in my early 20s until I got to grad school and kind of had that aha moment. But it's okay to be wrong. And so what if you're wrong? Your life is going to be fuller if you kind of raise your hand when you don't know the answer and to put out some idea and that others can build on, or that you can learn that, no, I don't understand this material. And maybe the thing that I don't understand is really fascinating. Mm-hmm. And in my case, it was, kind of psychology and understanding myself and why I had my fears, but also had my skills when it comes to interacting with the world. And how do I, turn that into kind of this crucible moment where I've learned, okay, because I've been willing to confront or at least analyze my, past experiences, my past failures. How can I take that and turn that into future success? And do I want to go down that path? But again, you asked me before, at the time, I didn't know. At the time, I wasn't listening to the feedback. I was in denial. But when I got older and got to grad school, I said, oh, that was really like one of the most important moments of my life, that I made a mistake, that I failed, even though I didn't want to admit it at the time. But that's been one of my big life lessons is like, go out and try things you haven't done. I just went out to California, didn't have a plan, tried things, didn't work out, made sense of it along the way, but listen to others, seek the counsel of others who've traveled the path before you, people who can give you a different perspective. And so for me, I had some very good mentors along the way, some good friends along the way, and they help put things in perspective. And, it's a journey that's both internal, but it's also us going through the world and figuring out what are those next 3 steps.
And it seems like along your way, after you would take each 3 steps, you would give yourself room to evaluate and look back and see, okay, these are the things I did well, these are the things I did wrong. What's the importance of that on an individual level as well as for organizations who often don't do that?
Yeah, and so it's the after action review, it's the going back and doing the post-mortem in terms of project. But many companies think, well, we don't need to spend any time on that. We need to get onto the next project and be more efficient. And sometimes people are the same way. I don't want to dwell on the mistakes I made in the past and like, don't remind me of that. That's too traumatic, or I don't, it doesn't make me feel good. And I think I was someone, I think you were kind in the kind of the characterization that I was evaluating. I think I was more ruminating and obsessing over why did I make those mistakes. But eventually I matured and learned to like, okay, accept who you are. You're not perfect. You've made mistakes. Acknowledge and move on. But you have to take the learning from that. What are you going to do differently? How are you going to be better? And sometimes that means I'm not good at this. I'm not going to do that. Other times you might say, these are areas that are really important to me. I'm not good at it, but I want to get better. And so that's something that's very important to your career, because I've had a lot of people that have been promoted to manager or more senior roles where they had to manage a lot of people. And it was no longer about them being the engineer or them being the person who was creating, but it was them managing people who were creating or analyzing or doing what they used to love doing. So most of my career was helping those people promoted into those new roles to be better managers and leaders, what I originally wanted to do. But sometimes that meant they wanted to go back to being an individual contributor. They wanted to go back to the creative work. They wanted to go back to the analytical work. They wanted to go back to the work that gave them value, gave them purpose. And that's, for me, where I don't supervise people anymore, and that's fine. I got much better at it. But that's not something I need to do. What I'd like to do is help people. And so if that's through teaching, then that's something I find very helpful. And it's very similar to what I did in organizations, because I always really like to work with the people who wanted my help. And I always had a bias, but then, the senior people were like, well, you need to go, teach these people how to have better team skills or how to deal with conflict, when the underlying issue was not their skill, it was the organizational culture, or it was something that was going on in terms of not having adequate resources or not having good communication with the middle or upper management. And so those kind of conflicts that were inherent in the organizational system, which often biases value creation, and by value we mean revenue and profit, that was not driving for me. I worked for a company that had total shareholder return as their purpose. And very few people who didn't have stock options really got excited about that. So it always comes back to, and as you get older, you realize, what are those things that help me to maximize my kind of purpose, which is helping people? What are those things that are helping other people? And so it's not to fault any organization for wanting to create value in their products and services, how they do it. It's just, you have to say, what's your personal mission statement? What do you want to do? And again, for our listeners, it took me 20 plus years to really figure that out. So be comfortable not knowing. And if something is not working, what can you learn from that? What can you do? How can you bring what works with you to your next position or experience? And how can you say, these are things that I don't want to do? And to actively, work on finding the best fit for you, both in terms of your professional kind of career path and the organization you choose to work in.
And you currently found your purpose within teaching, but you also stated that you're applying a lot of the same skill base. So focusing in reflection not only on outcome, but rather process, can help you transfer those skills to where your passions lie. Would you say that people at any age in any career field should focus more on process reflection rather than just solely reflecting on outcome?
Well, I think it's beneficial to focus on both to a point. I mean, so let's just take, what's important to most people, which is money. You got to pay the bills and pay the rent. And so if you're not making enough money to meet your life goals, provide for your family, whatever it is, you need to focus on, how am I going to get into a career that's going to meet my minimum financial requirements? Once you've addressed that, now you can focus more on what are the things, the process that I enjoy, right? And it's the how work gets done. Do I have a choice of employers? Maybe you go from a for-profit to a not-for-profit. So maybe it's someone who's in accounting. They're doing the exact same work. They used to get paid 6 figures. Now they're getting paid 75. Well, if they're financially secure and they have a much better work environment, better work-life balance, that might be a huge plus in their life. And they actually identify more with the purpose of that nonprofit. For others, it might be a completely different situation. It might be going from a large firm to a small startup where they used to do only one thing and got bored, and now they get to do 10 different things every day and they don't know what it's going to bring. But for someone else, it's the exact opposite. They like structure and they want to go to that big firm where they know what to expect every day. And all those things are fine, but it comes down to you have to start with you as an individual. And that's why when we teach organizational behavior, we almost always start with knowing yourself, your personality, your preferences, and then how do you fit into a team? How do you fit into an organization? So outcome is very important because you have to make sure you're meeting your long-term goals. But assuming you are, the process to me is much more I think, enjoyable and fruitful in terms of putting your time and effort there.
I think that leads greatly into my last question, which is we're all trying to become the best manager of our own lives. Mm-hmm. And translating that from an organizational standpoint to managing all the relationships and chaotic day-to-day events that everyone has on their schedule is difficult. Even for students, for example, they have classes and extracurriculars and friends and family and maybe a loved one on campus. How do people in general, whether they be students, professionals, or even friends or family members, become the best manager of their own lives?
Well, that is, I think, a question that could fill its own podcast. I would have to say it's knowing what motivates you, knowing what truly gives you joy, what gives you purpose, what to you creates value in your life. And that balance is going to be different for everyone. I love to do kind of hands-on home improvement projects, working on the car, anything like with mechanical stuff. I love doing that. Other people hate doing that. And they're like, oh my God, that's, just boring work, or I'm not good at it. I'll pay someone to do that. So it's about knowing you. So in my day job, I get to have lots and lots of relationships and very meaningful conversations. And in my personal life, I get to have that. But when it's me time, downtime, I just want to go and work on something. And that's my time away from that. But that only comes by knowing who you are and what drives you. So it comes back to our conversation about the values. So what do you value? What's important to you? And, how do you balance that in your life? And so I think for students, I think that they feel like so much of their life is externally regulated. There's schedules. You have to be at class at a certain time. Like, when I get, out of here and I'll make my own schedule. Well, most of them are going to work for an organization where they got to be at their desk at 8 o'clock and they're going to have to be traveling to Cincinnati for that client pitch. And, so that your time is not really on. But you have to make your own time. You have to say, what are those things that are important to me? And maybe you love running. Well, you can do running when you travel to Cincinnati. Or maybe you love spending time with your family and friends, and you make sure you prioritize that and you get a job where you can have your weekends to yourself. If it's about climbing that career ladder and making vice president by the time you're 30, then maybe you are going to work every weekend. But again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's what's important to you, what drives you, and as I think I have kind of stated, it's okay to realize halfway through your career, like, no, I want to do something different.
So just to conclude things, I would take that final point to be find your value as an individual, find where your true passions lie, and that will drive success both in your personal and professional life. So starting with yourself as an individual, but truly seeking out that feedback in those relationships with others will only help you realize who you truly are. I'd like to thank you for your time, Dr. Matt, and overall, this has just been a super beneficial experience for not only the listeners, but for myself personally, so thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, Sam, and I hope that your listeners found it to be useful.